The first time Mark Tanner noticed the footprints, he almost convinced himself they were his own. They appeared in the soft soil beneath his tomato garden on a Tuesday morning in late August, a week after moving into the house on Crescent Drive. His new house. The house he'd spent 3 years saving for, working 70-hour weeks at the accounting firm, eating lunch at his desk, driving a 2012 Honda Civic that still ran on prayers and duct tape. The house was supposed to be his sanctuary, a clean break from the apartment complex life, from shared walls and neighbors whose music bled through at 2 in the morning. He stood in his boxer shorts and faded MIT t-shirt, coffee steaming in his hand, staring at the prints. They were small, child-sized. Mark frowned, shook his head, and made a mental note to check the gate latch. Kids climbed fences. That was just what happened in suburbs. He'd accepted that reality during the home inspection, noticed the neighborhood had plenty of families. He'd even smiled at a few during his move-in week, watching their kids play on the streets while parents waved from porches. He wasn't the type of person to get worked up about a few footprints. That night, he installed motion sensor lights. By Friday, there were more prints and something worse. The plants themselves had been disturbed. Tomatoes pulled from vines, not ripe yet, left rotting on the ground. His basil had been trampled. In his vegetable garden, someone had drawn crude stick figures in the overturned dirt. Mark called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher was polite but unhelpful. "Kids being kids," she'd said, which somehow felt both sympathetic and dismissive. They'd send an officer by, she promised, but the backyard invasion wasn't exactly a priority. The officer never came. That Saturday morning, Mark was washing his car when he heard the voice. "You're the new guy." He turned to see a woman standing at the fence line, hands on her hips. She was tall, athletic in that way that suggested she'd been training for something her whole life. A charity marathon, perhaps, or general dominance. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an immaculate ponytail. She wore athleisure that probably cost more than Mark's entire workout wardrobe, which consisted of 2 pairs of basketball shorts and a handful of t-shirts from the 2000s. "Mark Tanner," he said, setting down his sponge. "Just moved in last week." "Karen Richardson," the woman said, not offering her hand. "I'm 4 houses down, the one with the stone mailbox." Mark vaguely remembered it, ostentatious, very Karen. "Nice to meet you," Mark said, returning to his car. "I wanted to introduce myself because I wanted to give you a heads up," Karen continued, unfazed by his obvious desire to return to washing. "This is a very family-oriented community, a lot of kids, a lot of activity. Some people coming in from out of town, they find that challenging." "I like kids," Mark said, running the sponge over the driver's side door. "I'm sure it's fine." "Well, I have 3 boys," Karen said. "Excellent boys, 10, 12, and 14, very active in sports, very energetic. They sometimes use the woods behind the properties for exploration, and occasionally they might accidentally cut through yards. I wanted you to know in advance so you wouldn't be the type to get upset about something innocent." There it was, the preemptive strike, the establishment of narrative. Mark turned to face her fully. "Are your sons the ones pulling up my vegetables?" Karen's expression shifted infinitesimally, a tightening around the eyes. "I highly doubt that. My boys have their own gardens. They're very into organic farming as a hobby." There were footprints and stick figures drawn in my dirt. "Children play," Karen said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "If you're going to be the type of neighbor who accuses people's children of vandalism based on footprints, we're going to have a real problem. This neighborhood doesn't appreciate that kind of attitude." The certainty in her voice struck him most. She wasn't defensive because her kids might have been guilty. She was defensive because she genuinely didn't see them as capable of doing anything wrong. And more than that, she was establishing the social hierarchy. She'd lived here longer. She knew more people. Mark was the newcomer, and if he started making trouble, she would make sure that trouble followed him. "I'm not accusing anyone," Mark said carefully. "I'm just saying someone was in my yard." "Well, be more welcoming to the community," Karen said, and then she smiled. It was the smile of a woman who'd won a conversation she'd choreographed entirely by herself. "Fences are for keeping people out. Maybe that's not the energy you want to send in a neighborhood like this." She walked away before Mark could respond. That night, Mark installed a lock on his side gate. He told himself it was just precautionary, practical, the kind of thing any new homeowner would do. But lying in bed, Listening to the sound of the wind through his open window, he felt a flutter of something beneath his chest. Not quite fear, but something adjacent. The sense of having made an enemy before he'd even had a chance to make a friend. The second week passed quietly, too quietly. Mark went to work, came home, tended his garden. The motion sensor lights activated a few times, animals probably. A raccoon, a possum, the natural wildlife of the neighborhood going about its business. Then came Friday night. Mark was in his living room, laptop open on his legs, working through a client's tax return with the kind of focus that had become his default mode. He'd learned early on that work was the best distraction, the best anesthetic. Keep moving, keep producing, keep advancing. The hole in his chest from the divorce remained, but he'd gotten very good at not looking at it directly. The sound came from the backyard, a crash, sharp and unmistakable, glass maybe, or something falling. Mark closed his laptop, moved to the sliding glass doors. The backyard was dark beyond the motion sensor's reach. He could see the perimeter, the fence, the outline of his small shed, nothing obvious. He waited. Nothing happened. At 11:47 p.m., he was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. Children's laughter. Multiple kids trying to stay quiet but failing, that distinctive cacophony of suppressed giggles that inevitably leaks out despite their best efforts. Mark was on his feet before he was fully conscious, stumbling toward the window. He caught a glimpse of movement near his shed. 4 shapes, small and quick, moving with the kind of coordinated silence that suggested they'd done this before. Done it multiple times. By the time Mark made it downstairs and outside, they were gone. But his shed was open. His tools were scattered across the ground, his good shovel, his pruning shears, his expensive cordless drill that he'd treated like a cherished child. They hadn't stolen anything as far as he could tell. They just explored, invaded, left evidence of their presence like animals marking territory. Mark stood in the darkness, hands clenched into fists, trying to control his breathing. This was trespassing. This was theft of privacy, of safety, of the sanctity that was supposed to come with owning a home. Every evening now, he'd have to wonder. Every night would be spent in a state of low-level alert, listening for sounds that didn't belong. He spent Saturday morning installing a proper lock on his shed door and a security camera that he angled to capture the entire backyard. The camera had cloud storage and motion alerts. Now, whenever anything triggered it, his phone would buzz with a notification. He would see his backyard being invaded in real time. He told himself it was just about safety, about documentation, about being prepared. But the truth was darker than that. The truth was that he'd decided to watch, to gather evidence, to build a case against Karen Richardson's perfect sons and their innocent exploration. The recordings came through on Tuesday night. Motion detected at 11:34 p.m. Mark opened the app, his heart rate spiking as the footage loaded. 4 kids exactly as he'd seen, but the camera caught details his eyes had missed. The oldest one, probably the 14-year-old, had a backpack. The 12-year-old was laughing so hard he could barely move. The youngest, maybe 10, was daring the others to climb onto the shed roof. They were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push. The video showed them trying the shed door, now locked so they couldn't get in. Showed them attempting to climb the fence and failing. Showed them sitting in his grass for nearly 10 minutes, doing nothing, just being where they weren't supposed to be, and laughing like it was the greatest adventure ever conceived by a 10-year-old's mind. Mark watched the footage 3 times. On the 4th viewing, something shifted in him. He'd been thinking about this wrong. He'd been thinking defensively, reactively. He'd been thinking like a victim. But victims were powerless. What if he wasn't? The idea came to him fully formed at 2:47 a.m. while he was lying in bed, unable to sleep. A prank sprinkler system. But not just any prank. A targeted one, designed specifically to catch intruders at night. Motion triggered, powerful enough to soak whoever triggered it, humiliating enough to deter them from ever coming back. It would be legal. It was his property. He could water his yard whenever he wanted. If someone broke into his backyard at night and happened to get wet, that wasn't his fault or his responsibility. It wasn't even a prank, really. It was just the natural consequence of trespassing. Mark got out of bed and went to his computer. He spent the next 6 hours researching pressure-activated irrigation systems, motion-triggered sprinklers, and the legal implications of property defense mechanisms. He read forums where people discussed protecting their yards from deer, from rabbits, from unwanted foot traffic. He found a company that manufactured heavy-duty motion-activated systems designed for large properties and high-traffic areas. The system he selected could be configured to activate with minimal pressure. Essentially, any motion would trigger a burst of pressurized water. The website said it could reach up to 30 feet with intense pressure, perfect for a backyard the size of his. By 8:45 a.m., he'd ordered the system and expedited shipping. It arrived 3 days later. Mark installed it over a Saturday afternoon, working methodically, carefully placing the motion sensors in positions that would catch anyone entering his yard from the fence line. He ran the hoses under his landscaping, disguising them as much as possible. He tested it repeatedly, adjusting the pressure and direction until he was satisfied. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. From the ground level, you couldn't tell it was there. The sensors were small, camouflaged. The hoses blended into the garden beds. It looked like normal yard work, normal landscaping. But it was waiting. He programmed it to activate every night at 9 p.m., to respond to motion with a 5-second burst of water, then reset for 15 minutes before it could be triggered again. That would give him time to check the camera footage, to see who had triggered it, to gather more evidence. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, the motion sensors activated at 2:17 a.m., but it was just a raccoon. The third night, Mark was beginning to think maybe they'd given up. Maybe Karen had warned her sons off. Maybe they'd found somewhere else to play their games. Then came the Saturday night. The camera alert came through at 11:56 p.m. Mark was already in bed, phone within arm's reach, and he opened the footage with trembling fingers. 4 shapes, moving across his yard with the confidence of people who'd done this a dozen times before. They'd found the pattern, probably. They knew it took 15 minutes for the system to reset. They were coming with more frequency now, more boldness, pushing harder. The oldest one, definitely the 14-year-old, tall and lean, was carrying something, a baseball bat. Mark's breath caught. The kid wasn't moving toward the house. He was moving toward Mark's prized Japanese maple, the one he'd planted 3 weeks ago, the one he'd spent 2 hours getting into exactly the right position, the one he'd watered daily despite the late August heat. The oldest kid raised the bat and swung. Even on the silent video, Mark could see the impact. The small tree swayed violently. The bat connected again and again with mechanical precision. The youngest kids laughed. Mark could see their mouths moving, see the delight in their movements, while the middle child filmed it on his phone. Filming it, recording the destruction for posterity. Mark was on his feet before the thought fully formed. He was moving, running, his body operating on pure adrenaline. He didn't think about the consequences. Didn't think about what Karen Richardson might do, or what the neighbors might say, or what the legal implications might be. He thought only about his tree, destroyed by a kid wielding a bat like an instrument of casual cruelty. He yanked open the sliding glass door and ran into the yard, still in his t-shirt and pajama pants. "Hey," he screamed. "Hey, stop." The kids froze. For a moment, everyone stood perfectly still, Mark approaching from the house, the 4 children caught in the middle of the backyard, all of them suspended in a moment of shocking clarity where intentions collided with reality. Then the 14-year-old dropped the bat and ran. The others followed, scrambling for the fence, moving with the panicked desperation of people who'd suddenly realized that their actions had witnesses. Mark chased them, not to catch them, but to document, to make it real, to transform them from abstract invaders into concrete faces he could identify. The oldest one, the one with the bat, turned as he was climbing the fence. In the light of Mark's motion sensors, Mark could see his face clearly. Angry, defiant, not scared or ashamed, but genuinely angry, as if Mark was the one in the wrong, the one who'd violated the rules of their unspoken agreement. "You shouldn't have locked your shed," the kid shouted. "You shouldn't have been such a dick about people using your yard." And then he was gone, over the fence, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Mark stood in the middle of his yard, breathing hard, staring at his destroyed tree. The Japanese maple was done for. The trunk was splintered in 3 places. The branches hung at broken angles. It would never recover. It would die slowly over the coming weeks, a monument to casual vandalism. Mark turned and walked back inside. He didn't think about calling the police anymore. He didn't think about talking to Karen Richardson or going through proper channels or any of the rational adult responses to the situation. He went to his computer and opened the footage again. He zoomed in on the oldest child's face and captured a screenshot, then another. He downloaded the entire video file. Evidence. Now he had evidence. Monday morning, Mark didn't go into work. He called his boss and claimed he was sick. He took a personal day. What he actually did was sit at his kitchen table with his laptop, staring at the screenshot of the 14-year-old's face. The kid had a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Mark zoomed in on it, made sure he could see it clearly. Then he opened Google and searched for teenage boys' Crescent Drive neighborhood and variations on that theme, looking for school rosters, sports teams, anything that might connect this face to a name. He got nowhere. By afternoon, he'd shifted tactics. He did a reverse image search, scraped social media, looked for any online presence of the Richardson boys. Nothing came up. Karen clearly kept her kids' digital presence locked down. No Instagram, no TikTok, no public presence at all. But he knew their names, he realized. Karen had mentioned them. 2 of her sons were 10, 12, and 14. He knew they lived on Crescent Drive. He knew they'd destroyed his property, and he knew they'd do it again. The motion-triggered sprinkler system was still sitting by his fence, fully installed, programmed, waiting. Mark had been thinking of it as a prank, a deterrent, a way to scare them off without actually hurting anyone. But as he sat in his kitchen at 3:47 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, staring at the face of a kid who deliberately swung a baseball bat at his property, the definition of prank began to shift in his mind. What happened next wouldn't be his fault. It would just be the natural consequence of trespassing on someone else's property, of breaking the rules, of testing a boundary and learning that boundaries had teeth. Mark spent Tuesday and Wednesday fine-tuning the system. He increased the pressure to the maximum safe setting. He adjusted the sensors so they'd be even more sensitive. He tested it repeatedly, timing how long it took to activate, measuring the force of the water burst, calculating the coverage area. By Wednesday evening, the system was a weapon. By Thursday, he almost didn't think of it as a weapon anymore. He'd convinced himself it was just a practical defense mechanism, a learning tool, a way to establish consequences for actions. That was the story he told himself as he activated the system for the evening. That was the story he held on to as midnight passed and the first night of September began. And that was the story he was still telling himself when, at 1:23 a.m. on Friday, September 2nd, the motion sensors activated. The camera footage showed 4 kids climbing through his yard, moving with the particular confidence of people who'd learned the patterns, who'd calculated the risks, who decided they could do this again and again without consequences. But this time, the system was ready. This time, Mark had changed the rules. From the 14-year-old's perspective, later, when he was being questioned by police and his clothes were in an evidence bag, it must have felt like the entire yard suddenly transformed into a weapon. He was mid-stride, probably heading for his favorite route across the lawn toward the fence, when the first sensor activated. A burst of pressurized water erupted from the ground 5 feet in front of him, so forceful that it knocked him backward and sent him sprawling across the grass. The pressure was intense, designed for agricultural use, meant to water large fields, calibrated far beyond anything a residential sprinkler system should produce. Mark watched the footage later, watched it 17 times if he was being honest with himself, and the violence of it struck him in unexpected ways. The kid's arms windmilled as the water caught him. He went down hard, gasping, shocked. But the worst part wasn't that. The worst part was what came next. The kid's friends panicked. The 12-year-old started running, but the system was too fast, too smart. As soon as he crossed the next sensor's path, another burst activated, this one catching him in the chest, sending him tumbling forward. The 10-year-old screamed, a genuinely terrified sound that echoed across the suburban quiet of 1:23 a.m., and tried to climb the fence. But the water was coming from multiple directions now, the system confused by multiple triggers, firing in overlapping bursts that created a chaos of spray and pressure and blind panic. The fourth kid, the one Mark had thought was filming, simply ran directly for the fence, not bothering with stealth or strategy, just pure flight. He made it over before the sensors could recalibrate. But the 14-year-old was still down, choking on water, gasping like he'd nearly drowned. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, Mark felt a spike of genuine fear that he'd actually hurt the kid. That something in his chest had twisted, and he'd crossed a line he didn't know existed until it was behind him. Then the kid scrambled to his feet, swearing loudly, and limped toward the fence, water still pouring off him in sheets. He made it over with difficulty, landing hard on the other side, and then they were gone, all of them, scattered into the darkness, leaving wet footprints and a sense of violated safety that stretched across the yard like a stain. Mark sat in his living room, holding his phone, watching the footage play on repeat. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that this was appropriate, that you couldn't blame a man for protecting his property. But his heart wouldn't slow down. By morning, he knew something had changed. The police showed up at 7:34 a.m. Mark was in his kitchen, working through his second cup of coffee, trying to construct a narrative that would sound reasonable when he heard the knock. Not aggressive, not urgent, just a regular suburban morning knock. But there was something heavier behind it, the weight of authority, the sense of questions that couldn't be answered with pleasantries. There were 2 officers. One looked like he'd been doing this job since the 1990s, with the weathered face and tired eyes of someone who'd heard every excuse, every justification, every version of "I didn't mean to" that the human condition had to offer. The other was younger, female, with the posture of someone still convinced that people generally did the right thing when confronted with the truth. "Mr. Tanner," the older one said, "I'm Officer Reeves, this is Officer Valdez. We're here about an incident on your property last night." An incident? Mark's voice sounded strange to himself, too high, too defensive. What incident? 4 minors were reportedly injured by a pressurized water system on your property, Officer Valdez said, consulting her notebook. We received a call from Karen Richardson at 6:47 a.m. this morning. One of the minors required emergency room treatment for a possible broken rib. They're all pretty shaken up. The words fell into Mark's chest like stones. A broken rib. He'd actually broken a kid's rib. They were trespassing, Mark said quickly. They've been coming into my yard for weeks, destroying my property. I installed the system to deter them. To deter them? Officer Reeves repeated, his tone suggesting he'd found the exact phrase that made the whole situation complicated. Not to scare them off, but to deter them. What's the difference? The difference is intent, Mark said, then immediately regretted it because it sounded like something a lawyer would say, and officers didn't like talking to people who talked like lawyers. Let me ask you something, Officer Reeves said, and Mark could see him shifting into a different mode, the mode of someone who was about to ask questions he already knew the answers to. When you installed this system, did you consider that someone might get hurt? No, I mean yes. I considered that it might startle them, make them leave. But you increased the pressure beyond normal specifications, Officer Valdez said, consulting her notebook again. Our investigation found the system was calibrated to nearly double the manufacturer's recommended settings. Is that accurate? Mark's mouth went dry. She'd already been to the house, already looked at the system. She already had evidence. I wanted it to be effective, Mark said. Effective at doing what? Officer Reeves asked. The question hung in the air between them, and Mark realized he'd walked into a trap of his own making. Whatever he answered would convict him. Effective at hurting them, effective at injuring them, effective at inflicting pain. At protecting my property, he said finally. From a 10-year-old? Officer Valdez asked, and the way she said it made clear what she thought of that answer. They didn't arrest him, but they didn't really leave either. They spent 45 minutes photographing the system, taking measurements, asking questions about his intent, his awareness of the danger, whether he'd warned anyone about the system's presence. They documented the destroyed tree, the scattered tools, the evidence of previous trespassing. But the damage was already done. By the time they left, Mark understood the narrative had shifted entirely. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was the threat. The angry man who'd installed a booby trap. And yes, they used that word. Officer Reeves said it clearly while talking into his radio, designed to injure children. "We'll be filing a report with the district attorney," Officer Valdez said as they left. "You should probably speak with an attorney yourself, Mr. Tanner. This situation is going to get more complicated before it gets better." Mark watched them drive away. Then he went to his backyard and stared at the motion-activated sprinkler system with something approaching horror. What had he done? Karen Richardson moved fast. The email came to Mark's personal account at 4:17 p.m. the next day, forwarded from his company's HR department. She'd sent it to multiple recipients, the senior partners at his firm, the board of directors, and copied his immediate supervisor. The email was a masterpiece of controlled fury. She detailed the assault on her children. She named the sprinkler system as a booby trap designed to inflict bodily harm. She included medical documentation of the broken rib, dated and timed perfectly to his actions. She described Mark as unstable and dangerous, someone who targeted children for defending themselves against an unjustified eviction from a community space. She also mentioned that her youngest had ongoing trauma from the incident, and described his nightmares, his anxiety, the way he now flinched at loud noises. And she concluded with a threat, barely veiled. "I trust you'll understand why I cannot recommend Mr. Tanner as a trustworthy member of the business community. This incident demonstrates a fundamental lack of judgment and an unwillingness to endanger children to satisfy personal grievances." The message was clear. His employment was now a liability. His boss called him into his office at 5:03 p.m. Robert Chen had been Mark's supervisor for 4 years. He was fair, reasonable, and pragmatic, the kind of guy who understood that humans were complicated, but that businesses couldn't be. When it came to PR disasters, Robert's instinct was always to distance himself from the problem as quickly as possible. "What the hell is this?" Robert said, tapping his screen where the email was displayed. Mark tried to explain. The trespassing, the vandalism, the system, the intent. But he could see the moment Robert stopped listening. It was somewhere between motion-triggered sprinkler system and increased the pressure to dangerous levels. "You booby-trapped your property," Robert said slowly, as if confirming the basic fact. "I installed a security system. That injured a child with a broken rib, according to the email. He was trespassing. I don't care if he was committing grand larceny," Robert said, and Mark could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of Mark's utility versus the liability his presence now represented. "You can't hurt people on your property. That's not how law works. That's not how society works." "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was trying to deter them. By installing an amplified water system that broke a child's rib," Robert said flatly. "Mark, I don't know if you realize this, but you have an actual legal problem, and our firm cannot be associated with that problem. We're looking at potential liability, reputation damage, all of it." The message was implicit but unmistakable. Mark was being sacrificed. "I need to place you on immediate administrative leave," Robert said. "Pending the outcome of legal proceedings, your security access will be revoked effective immediately." "Robert." "Don't," Robert said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who'd already made his decision. "Get an attorney. Do everything your attorney tells you to do, and don't contact anyone at this firm except through your legal representative. That's the best advice I can give you." Mark sat in his car in the parking garage for 3 hours before he could drive home. He'd lost his job, or rather, he'd put his job in a position where it had no choice but to abandon him. The firm would keep his name at arm's length for as long as legally possible. If anyone called for a reference, they'd cite policy and refuse to comment. He was radioactive. By the time he got home, it was 9:47 p.m. and his phone had accumulated 23 notifications. 2 were from his ex-wife, asking if the news was true and whether she should be concerned about this affecting their alimony arrangement. The rest were messages from friends he hadn't heard from in months, suddenly interested in whether he was okay and what happened. They'd seen something, news probably or social media. The story was spreading. Mark opened his browser and searched his own name. The article was from a local parenting blog, the kind of website that aggregated neighborhood drama and community conflicts. The headline read, "Suburban father booby traps yard, injures child, what every parent needs to know about your neighbor." The article was inflammatory but technically accurate. It cited KARENS' email. It referenced police reports. It quoted a source close to the family describing Mark as unstable and prone to overreacting to minor neighborhood disputes. And then, worst of all, it included comments from Karen herself. "I have been nothing but welcoming to Mr. Tanner," Karen was quoted as saying. "My children simply wanted to explore the community, maybe cut through his yard on their way home. There was no malice, no destruction. But Mr. Tanner decided to turn a minor neighborhood interaction into something dangerous. I only pray that other families in our community will be more vigilant about neighbors who present a risk to our children." It was a perfect performance of victimhood. She'd positioned herself as the concerned parent, the voice of reason, while Mark was the unstable antagonist. She'd established the narrative so completely that by the time people read the police reports or the actual facts, they would filter them through the lens she'd already created. She'd won. Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone, and felt something in him break apart. He'd made a terrible decision. He'd let anger and violation and frustration push him toward an action that had real consequences. And now, those consequences were eating him alive. His attorney, a woman named Patricia Morrison, was expensive and harried. Her office was in downtown, sleek and professional, the kind of place that charged by the minute and made you feel that every second you spent there was a second you couldn't afford. She'd represented her first white-collar crime in 1997 and had been building a reputation ever since. "Your situation is complicated," Patricia said, reviewing the files Mark had brought in. "On one hand, you have clear documentation of trespassing. The police have confirmed that multiple minors were on your property without authorization and that they damaged your property. That's all documented." "That's good," Mark said, feeling a spark of hope. "On the other hand," Patricia continued, not looking up from her papers, "you installed a system designed to harm people and calibrated it to inflict more harm than its manufacturer intended. That's a felony in this state. Assault with a dangerous weapon, possibly reckless endangerment. The fact that the victims are minors makes it worse." "But they were breaking into my house, my yard." "Your yard," Patricia said, finally looking up at him. "They weren't in your house. They were in your yard. There's a legal distinction there, and it's not in your favor. Booby traps are illegal, full stop. You can defend your home, you can defend your person, but you cannot set traps that activate without human agency. It's one of the oldest laws in this country." "Even if I didn't know they'd come back." "Especially if you didn't know they'd come back. Because then you're essentially accepting the risk that anyone, a mail carrier, a neighbor's kid, a delivery person, might trigger your system. The law is very clear. You can't unknowingly harm someone and claim self-defense. Intent matters, but so does foreseeability." Mark felt the last of his hope evaporate. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now the district attorney decides whether to press charges. If they do, we go to court. If they don't, you might avoid criminal prosecution, but Karen Richardson will almost certainly pursue a civil suit. She'll claim emotional distress, medical expenses, ongoing trauma, the works." "I can't afford that." "No," Patricia agreed. "You probably can't." For the next week, Mark retreated into his house like someone in quarantine. He didn't go to work. He wasn't allowed to. He didn't go outside. The neighbors were watching, or so it felt. He'd seen parents driving slowly past his house, kids pointing at his yard where the destroyed tree still stood, a monument to his failure. He spent his days reading legal forums, watching his phone for news, refreshing his email obsessively for updates from Patricia or the DA's office. He'd been fired from his firm. Robert had sent the official termination letter on day 3, and he was now drawing from his savings, a fund that was being rapidly depleted by legal fees and the basic necessities of existence. The story had spread beyond the local blog. A larger news outlet had picked it up. "Man installs illegal water system to teach neighborhood kids a lesson." The quotes around his intent were perfect. They made it clear that no matter what Mark had actually intended, the public narrative was what mattered. He got a letter from Karen's attorney on day 9. It was thick, official, filled with language about damages and compensation and the permanence of emotional trauma. It detailed the medical bills, $3,247 for emergency room treatment, x-rays, and follow-up visits for the broken rib. It estimated ongoing psychological treatment at $5,000. It factored in emotional distress, loss of enjoyment of community, and the reasonable fear that Mr. Tanner presents an ongoing threat to the Richardson family. The letter concluded with a demand for $87,500. Mark stared at that number for a long time. It was more than his annual salary had been. It was nearly the entirety of his savings. It was the price of his life being fundamentally altered by one moment of poor judgment. He called Patricia. "Can they do this?" he asked. "They just did," Patricia said. "The question is whether we settle or fight it, and that depends on what the DA decides about criminal charges." "Which is what?" "Which is still being determined. But Mark, I'm going to be honest with you, the DA's office is under a lot of pressure. A woman named KARENS Richardson has been calling multiple times a day. She's sent letters to the mayor, the city council, the local school board. She's making sure this stays visible. She's making it a question of public safety." "She's lying." "She's not lying about the broken rib. She's not lying about her child being injured on your property. Everything else is framing, and she's brilliant at it. The truth is, you gave her something to work with. You installed a trap. A child got hurt. No amount of legal argument changes that basic reality." After they hung up, Mark sat in silence for 3 hours. The breaking point came on day 12, when Mark opened his front door to retrieve his mail and found that someone had spray-painted "Child Killer" across his mailbox. It was crude, obviously done in anger, but it was also the physical manifestation of what everyone was thinking. The incarnation of the reputation he'd acquired. He'd gone from anonymous accounting professional to a cautionary tale about overreacting neighbors in less than 2 weeks. He pressure-washed the mailbox and stood in his driveway afterward looking at his house. The house he'd saved for, that represented years of discipline and sacrifice, and felt nothing but emptiness. By evening, he'd made a decision. He called Patricia and told her to offer a settlement. They negotiated down to $62,000, a number that would hollow out his savings but leave him technically solvent. KARENS accepted within an hour, not because it was satisfactory, Mark realized, but because it was enough. Enough to hurt him, enough to make a point, enough to establish that there were consequences for challenging her or her children. The settlement came with an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. Mark couldn't talk about the case, couldn't publicly defend himself, couldn't tell his side of the story. He had to accept the public narrative that had been written for him and live with it in silence. He was, in short, supposed to disappear. By the end of September, Mark had been unemployed for 2 weeks. He'd settled a lawsuit that had cost him nearly all of his savings, and he'd been transformed in the public eye from an innocent man protecting his property into a cautionary tale about suburban aggression and dangerous neighbors. He'd also started drinking, not heavily, not yet, but with the kind of regularity that suggested he was learning the habit for something worse. He sat in his living room on the last evening of September, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and thought about revenge. Not prank revenge, not humiliation or property damage or any of the small, stupid things that had led him here in the first place. Real revenge, the kind that would actually matter. KARENS Richardson had public status. She had friends. She had a reputation as a concerned parent, a community advocate, someone who cared about the children in her neighborhood. She had built that reputation carefully, methodically, and she'd used it as a weapon against him. What if someone were to dismantle that reputation? What if someone found what she was actually like, beneath the performance? What if someone made sure that everyone in her perfect suburban world understood what she really was? The thought took root in Mark's chest like a seed. And in the darkness of his house, alone and broke and humiliated, he began to water it. Mark's investigation of KARENS Richardson began with a single question. What kind of person orchestrates a campaign against someone and then feels no guilt about it? The answer, he suspected, was someone with a lot to hide. He started with public records, tax filings, property assessments, court documents. KARENS and her husband, David Richardson, had purchased their house in 2008 for $542,000. The mortgage had been paid off in 2015. They lived comfortably but not extravagantly. David worked in pharmaceutical sales, making decent money but nothing remarkable. KARENS worked part-time as an organizational consultant, a job that seemed to exist primarily on Zoom calls from her home office. Nothing jumped out as obviously corrupt or criminal. So Mark went deeper. He created an anonymous email address and spent hours on school databases, community group pages, social media platforms. He joined the local neighborhood Facebook group using a fake profile and watched how Karen interacted with other residents. She was helpful, thoughtful, the kind of person who remembered details about people's lives and followed up on them. "How's your daughter's soccer season going?" she'd ask someone 3 months after a casual conversation. She organized block parties. She arranged book clubs. She was, in short, performing the role of the perfect suburban woman perfectly. Mark found her Instagram account, which had been set to private, but he could see the profile picture and the public posts. She was a woman who carefully curated her life for display, pictures of her kids at sporting events, of vacations in places like Costa Rica and the Bahamas, of family dinners that looked like they came from magazines. Everything was filtered to show a family that had their lives figured out, that was thriving, that deserved respect and admiration. It made Mark sick. He dug deeper, searching for any crack in the facade. He found old articles about community events she'd organized. He found a feature in the local paper about her work with a nonprofit that helped struggling families. He found testimonials from women in her book club describing her as supportive, caring, and someone who really shows up for her friends. And then he found something. It was a deleted post, recovered through an archive site from the neighborhood Facebook group from 3 years ago. Someone had asked for recommendations for a babysitter. Karen had responded with a single word: "Avoid Jasmine Martinez, irresponsible, not trustworthy." Just that, no context, no elaboration. But Mark clicked through to find who Jasmine Martinez was. She was a teenager from the neighborhood who'd done some babysitting work. The comment had been posted on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Jasmine had quit babysitting and left the neighborhood. Her social media accounts were deleted. Her mother had eventually moved the family away. Over 3 years, Mark had one deleted Facebook comment. It was circumstantial, it was almost nothing, but it was something. He started asking questions in the neighborhood Facebook group, using his fake profile, asking people if they had babysitters to recommend. The responses came flooding in. 6 different people recommended different sitters, but 4 of them specifically mentioned that Karen Richardson had warned them away from certain people. "Karen said she wasn't reliable," one person wrote. "Karen told me to be careful with that sitter," another said. Over the course of 3 days, Mark mapped out a network of people Karen had warned against, insinuated about, or claimed had betrayed her. Some were service workers, cleaners, handymen, tutors. Others were neighbors. One was a teenage girl who'd apparently made a snide comment about Karen's holiday decorations. It was a pattern. Karen Richardson didn't just protect her interests. She systematically destroyed the reputations of anyone who challenged her or failed to meet her standards. Mark realized she was a predator. Not the obvious kind, but the subtle kind. The kind that operated through social manipulation, through the careful destruction of reputation, through the weaponization of community trust. She was exactly what she'd accused him of being. She was just better at it. The next phase of Mark's investigation took him into Karen's volunteer work. He found the nonprofit she worked with, Community Springs, an organization dedicated to helping families in crisis. The organization was apparently very successful, having raised over $2 million in the past 5 years. Karen served on the board of directors. Mark created a different anonymous email account and requested financial transparency information. Most nonprofits were required to make that information publicly available. It took a few days, but the spreadsheets came through. He spent 6 hours analyzing the numbers. What he found was subtle but damning. The organization raised money for specific purposes: family assistance, emergency funds, childcare subsidies for low-income families. But nearly 40% of the money was being allocated to administrative overhead, salaries for staff members, board compensation. Karen's name appeared in the list of board compensation, $25,000 annually for her work as an organizational consultant. She was essentially being paid by a charity that served struggling families to perform work that wasn't clearly defined and wasn't clearly necessary. It was legal. It was probably technically justified. But it was also the kind of thing that, if the right people knew about it, would torpedo her reputation completely. Mark cross-referenced the other board members. They included a lawyer, a real estate developer, and a financial advisor. All of them were taking similar compensation. It was a subtle form of graft, not outright stealing, but a redirection of charitable resources that should have gone to needy families into the pockets of middle-class board members who already had plenty. It wasn't her alone, but Karen had orchestrated it. He could see her fingerprints in the structure, in the careful layers of complexity that made it hard to see what was actually happening. But Mark needed something more direct, something that would explain not just her corruption but her nature. He started watching her house. He didn't approach, didn't trespass, didn't do anything that would give her legal grounds to complain. He simply sat in his car, parked down the street, and observed. He noted her schedule. The time she left in the morning, the time she returned. When her kids came home from school, when deliveries arrived. He documented everything in a notebook, filling page after page with observations that added up to nothing in particular but felt, in aggregate, like evidence of something. It took 2 weeks before anything interesting happened. It was a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. One of Karen's sons, the 12-year-old, Mark thought, came home from school with a black eye. He was limping, favoring one leg, and even from the distance of across the street, Mark could see he was hurt. Karen met him at the door. From his car, Mark watched her reaction. He expected concern, first aid, comfort. What he saw was different. Karen grabbed the boy's arm, pulled him inside quickly, as if she didn't want the neighbors to see. The door closed. Through the living room window, Mark watched as Karen stood over the boy, her hands on her hips, her body language aggressive. She was saying something. The boy was responding, shaking his head, and she was shaking her head back more forcefully. Then she raised her hand. She didn't hit him, not that Mark could see from his car, but the gesture was unmistakable. A threat. A moment where her anger was visible and sharp. The boy flinched. And then she left the room, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the living room. Mark sat in his car, breathing hard, trying to process what he'd seen. Anger management issues, emotional volatility, the kind of thing that looked different when you weren't performing for an audience. Over the next few weeks, Mark documented more incidents. Karen arguing with her husband in the driveway, her voice sharp enough to carry across the street. Karen pushing one of her sons after he'd failed to take out the trash. Karen canceling a neighborhood coffee date at the last minute with a message that suggested she was furious at someone about something. The cracks in the facade were becoming visible once you knew where to look. And the more Mark watched, the more convinced he became that Karen Richardson's performance of the perfect suburban mother was exactly that, a performance. Beneath it was someone angry, manipulative, someone who used her children and her standing in the community as tools to get what she wanted. She was a bully who'd targeted him because he wouldn't accept her authority. And when he'd fought back, however badly he'd fought back, she'd destroyed him. Now it was time to even the score. Mark's plan began to take shape in November. It would be elegant, it would be true, and it would be devastating. He would compile everything he'd learned about Karen, the financial improprieties, the bullying behavior, the pattern of destroying reputations, the apparent abuse of her own children. Then he would present it to the community, not as allegations but as facts, documented, confirmed, irrefutable. He would use social media, email, whatever channels he could find. He would make sure that every person in the neighborhood understood that Karen Richardson was not the person she'd claimed to be. Her perfect reputation would shatter. She'd experience the same humiliation he'd experienced. She'd find herself isolated, friendless, considered a threat. She'd learn what it felt like to have your life dismantled by public judgment. It would be justice, it would be righteous. Mark spent 3 weeks compiling his dossier on Karen Richardson. He organized the financial documents, the screenshots of deleted posts, the photographs he'd taken of her interactions with her children. He wrote a detailed narrative explaining what he'd found, framing it as a concerned community member who'd noticed some troubling patterns. He did everything carefully, staying just on the right side of legality. He didn't make accusations he couldn't document. He didn't use her children's names directly. He stayed focused on behavior, on documented facts, on the things that could be verified. By the time he finished, he had a document that was 47 pages long. It was detailed, compelling, and it would be absolutely catastrophic to Karen's reputation. Mark drafted the first email, addressing it to every member of the neighborhood Facebook group. He included the dossier as an attachment. He titled it, Important information about a trusted community member, what you need to know. He wrote a carefully worded introduction that positioned him as someone who was reluctantly coming forward, someone who tried to stay silent but felt obligated to warn others, someone who cared about the community and couldn't stay quiet anymore. It was performative, it was manipulative, it was exactly what Karen would have written. He had the email open in his draft folder for 3 days, ready to send it. He'd read it dozens of times, each time feeling more certain that this was the right thing to do, that Karen deserved to experience the same treatment she'd inflicted on him. He'd even set a time to send it, a Wednesday morning when it would get maximum visibility, when people would have time to read it and begin spreading it before Karen had a chance to respond. But something stopped him. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't moral clarity or a sudden realization of his own wrongdoing. It was something smaller, something that came to him on a Tuesday night while he was reading through his dossier one more time. He realized that if he sent this email, he wouldn't be any better than Karen. He would be worse because he would be doing it deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing. Karen had destroyed him in a moment of anger and righteousness, believing that her cause was just. Mark was planning to do the same thing, with the added malice of premeditation and calculation. He would become the thing he hated. Mark sat in front of his computer for a long time. Then he moved his mouse to the delete button and hovered over it. The cursor blinked, waiting. He thought about his life, about the job he'd lost, the money he'd spent, the reputation he'd acquired. He thought about all of it, all the pain, all the humiliation, all the ways that one moment of poor judgment had cascaded into something much larger. And he thought about what he would become if he went through with this. He clicked delete. The email disappeared. Mark closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his house, feeling something shift inside him. Not redemption. He wasn't naive enough to think one decision could undo all the damage. But recognition, maybe, understanding. He'd spent 7 weeks trying to destroy someone else to make himself feel better. And he'd failed not because of moral weakness, but because he'd finally seen that it wouldn't actually change anything. It would just create another victim, another person destroyed by the machinery of public judgment. The only person who could fix his life was him. Mark made his first real decision toward change on a Wednesday morning in November. He called Patricia Morrison and told her to prepare for a civil suit against him, not to defend against it, but to accept liability. He would take responsibility for his actions. He would admit to installing the booby trap. He would testify, if necessary, about his intent. "That's not a smart legal strategy," Patricia said immediately. "I know," Mark said, "but it's the right one." "Mark, they could charge you criminally. Reckless endangerment of a minor is a felony. They could press charges if you're seen to be taking responsibility." "Then let them press charges," Mark said. "I did it. I need to stop pretending I didn't." There was a long silence on the line. "You're having some kind of breakdown," Patricia said finally. "Maybe," Mark said, "but I'm done lying to myself about this." The letter Mark's attorney sent to KARENS' legal team was short. It stated that Mark accepted full responsibility for the incident. He would not contest liability. He would be willing to pay damages beyond the settlement if appropriate. He asked only for the opportunity to meet with Karen and her family to apologize. The response came within 2 hours. Karen's attorney rejected the apology, stated that reconciliation is not an option and that the matter was effectively closed as far as the Richardson family was concerned. Asked that Mark cease all further contact. Mark accepted this. He hadn't really expected a different answer. What he did instead was more personal. He started by driving to the emergency room where the 14-year-old had been taken. It was a Tuesday afternoon, mid-November. Mark had dressed carefully, good clothes but not too formal. He carried a letter handwritten that he'd spent hours composing. The letter was addressed to the Richardson boys. In it, Mark apologized for his actions. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't explain why he'd done it. He simply stated that he'd installed the system with the intention of harming them, that it was wrong, and that he was sorry. He also included something else. He'd made arrangements with a local youth center to establish a small scholarship fund, $5,000 total, to be distributed to kids from the neighborhood who wanted to participate in after-school programs or summer camps. It wasn't much. It was basically the remaining money in his savings account after legal fees. But it would be there in his name for anyone to benefit from. He asked the hospital receptionist if she could pass the letter along to the Richardson family. She said they didn't have contact information for patients, but she'd put it with their hospital records. Maybe they'd get it, maybe they wouldn't. Mark didn't expect them to. The second thing he did was walk up to KARENS Richardson's house on a Saturday afternoon. He didn't bring flowers or gifts or anything that could be construed as manipulation. He simply walked up to her door, knocked, and waited. KARENS answered. She was alone, which was fortunate because it meant this could be private. Her face went white when she saw him. "Mr. Tanner." "I'm leaving," Mark said quickly, seeing her reach for her phone. "I just wanted to say one thing and then I'll leave and you'll never see me again, I promise." KARENS' hand hesitated on her phone. "What you did to me, how you handled the situation, how you destroyed my reputation, how you made me seem like the villain, it was effective," Mark said. "You're very good at that, at performance, at making other people see what you want them to see. And I don't expect you to care about this, but you should know, I understand now why you did it, because that's what you do. You protect yourself and your family and you don't care who you hurt in the process." "Get off my property," KARENS said. "I'm going," Mark said. "But I also want you to know that I'm not going to do to you what you did to me. I have information that could destroy you, your financial dealings with the nonprofit, your treatment of people in this community, the pattern of manipulation. I could send it to people. I could make your life very difficult, and I'm not going to." KARENS' expression shifted from fear to calculation. She was assessing whether he was bluffing, what he actually knew, what the threat level really was. "Not out of forgiveness," Mark continued. "I'm not forgiving you, but because the cycle has to stop somewhere, and I'm choosing to stop it with me. So you won, you destroyed me, that's what you wanted, and you accomplished it. But you're not going to have to destroy me again because I'm going to be gone." He turned and walked away before she could respond. He could feel her watching him from the doorway, trying to process what he'd said, whether it was a trap, whether she needed to do anything else. But Mark meant it. He was done. Not with his life. He would rebuild it slowly in whatever form it took. But with the war between them, with the cycle of escalation and retaliation. He walked back to his car and drove home, and something inside him felt lighter than it had in months. The hardest part came in early December, when Mark decided to leave. Not the neighborhood. He'd stay there, deal with the consequences of his visibility, accept that people would recognize him and whisper about him. But leave his current life. His career in accounting, which was closed to him now. His relationship with his ex-wife, which had become more strained by the scandal. His sense of being trapped in the narrative that KARENS had written for him. He decided to go back to school. He dropped out of college 20 years ago, back when he'd gotten married to his college girlfriend, and decided that his future was more important than a degree. That decision had led to accounting, to a decent but unremarkable career, to a life that was stable and successful but ultimately empty. Now, with his savings depleted and his career destroyed, he could finally pursue the thing he'd wanted to study in the first place, environmental science. It was impractical. He was 44 years old, broke, and notorious in his community. Returning to school seemed like the kind of decision someone in the depths of a breakdown would make. But Mark had started to understand that the breakdown might be exactly what he needed. Before he left, he did one more thing. He removed the sprinkler system from his yard. He did it carefully, methodically, documenting each piece as he disassembled it. He was doing this as much for himself as for anything else, a physical act of undoing, of removing the mechanism of his worst decision. He put the components in boxes and donated them to a construction school's training program, not as penance, but as acknowledgement. The tools he'd used to try to hurt people could still be used to build something. His yard was just grass and dirt and the skeleton of plants that had suffered from neglect. The Japanese maple was dead, as he'd known it would be. He cut it down and had it removed. By the time he was done, his backyard looked like a blank slate. Mark's departure from his house came on a cold Friday in mid-December. He rented a small apartment near the state university, close enough to the campus that he could explore the layout, walk the grounds, imagine his new life there. The apartment was tiny, barely more than a dorm room with a kitchenette, but it was exactly what he could afford. He left the house on Crescent Drive mostly furnished. He couldn't sell it easily. The market was against him, and his name was still toxic enough that real estate agents were reluctant to list it. He set up a rental arrangement instead, working with a property management company to lease it out. It wouldn't provide him with income exactly, but it would cover the mortgage and property taxes. It would keep him from losing the biggest investment he'd made. The last thing he did before leaving was walk through the empty house and try to remember why he'd wanted it so badly. He walked through the kitchen, the living room, the master bedroom. None of it triggered the joy he'd expected when he'd first seen the place. Instead, he felt a kind of sadness. The house represented a version of himself that no longer existed, the version that believed that success was about accumulation, about markers of achievement, about proving something to the world. That version was dead, and Mark wasn't entirely sure what was supposed to replace it. But the only way to find out was to move forward. The notification about the fire came through his phone on a Tuesday in January. Mark was in his first week of spring semester classes when he got the alert from the local news app. House fire in Crescent Drive neighborhood, one family displaced. The address was 3 houses down from his old house. Mark clicked through to the article. It was Karen Richardson's house. The fire had started in the garage for reasons that were still under investigation. It had spread to the main structure, causing extensive damage to multiple rooms. The family had escaped unharmed, but the house was effectively destroyed. An investigation was ongoing to determine whether the fire was accidental or deliberately set. Mark read the article 3 times, making sure he understood what had happened. Then he read the follow-up article, which quoted Karen describing the experience as traumatic and devastating. She spoke about the months of rebuilding they would face, the insurance complications, the disruption to their lives. "It's like the universe is punishing me for something," Karen was quoted as saying, her voice clearly shaken. "First with the situation with my neighbor and now this. Sometimes I wonder if I did something to deserve it." Mark set down his phone and sat very still. He had not set that fire. He had nothing to do with it. It was almost certainly accidental. A garage fire was a common enough occurrence, probably started by faulty wiring or a kid playing with something they shouldn't have been playing with. But the coincidence was staggering. Karen had destroyed Mark's financial security, his professional reputation, his peace of mind. She'd orchestrated a campaign that had cost him tens of thousands of dollars and months of suffering. And now, entirely by chance, something catastrophic had happened to her. It would have been easy to believe in karma, easy to believe that the universe was balancing the scales, easy to accept that she deserved it. And maybe, on some level, she did. But Mark found that he felt no satisfaction. Instead, he felt only a strange sort of sadness, because the cycle continued. She'd hurt him, he'd hurt her son, an accidental fire had hurt her. And none of it had actually made anything better. It had just created more victims, more damage, more suffering. He wondered if that was what would happen forever. If people could only hurt each other and hope that eventually, through some mechanism of consequence, they'd learn to stop. By the time Mark finished his first semester, he had learned more about himself than he had in the previous 20 years of his life. He learned that he was actually competent at science, that the parts of him that had been drawn to numbers and logic and accounting could find genuine expression in understanding ecosystem dynamics and environmental data analysis. He learned that returning to school at 44 was hard but not impossible, and that most of his younger classmates didn't actually care about his age if he didn't make them care about it. He also learned that rebuilding a life wasn't actually about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It was about the small, daily choices, showing up to class, finishing the readings, talking to classmates, applying for scholarships he didn't think he'd get, accepting rejection, trying again. It was the opposite of the decision to install the sprinkler system. Instead of one moment of intense action with massive consequences, it was hundreds of small moments that accumulated into something real. By spring, Mark had found a job working part-time at the university's environmental center, leading nature walks and helping with conservation projects. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover his rent and food, but it was meaningful work. He was outside, moving, using his body and his emerging knowledge to do something that actually mattered. The second semester was easier than the first, partly because he knew what to expect and partly because he'd found his people. There was a core group of environmental science students who gathered to study together, to complain about the workload, to dream about the kinds of work they wanted to do after graduation. Most of them were younger than him. All of them had fewer complicated life experiences, but they treated him as a peer, which Mark appreciated more than he could articulate. There was one student, a young woman named Sarah, who was also returning to school after time away, who became something like a friend. They'd study together sometimes, grabbing coffee and working on problem sets. She dropped out of college 10 years ago, spent the intervening decade working retail, and had decided at 32 that she wanted something different. They had never discussed the specific reasons for their returns to school, but Mark suspected Sarah had her own version of his story, some combination of life events that had forced her to reevaluate everything. One afternoon, sitting in a coffee shop, Sarah had asked him directly. "What brought you back?" she asked. "To school. You're not the type who usually comes back unless something forced you to." Mark had considered lying. It would have been easier, simpler, would have avoided the complicated explanation. Instead, he'd told her the truth, the core of it anyway. That he'd made a bad decision that had cost him everything, and that he'd decided the only way to move forward was to stop trying to recover his old life and build a new one instead. Sarah had nodded like that made perfect sense. "Yeah," she said. "Same. Not the same situation, but same energy. Sometimes you have to burn everything down before you can rebuild." "I didn't burn anything down," Mark said. "I tried to, but it ended up burning me instead." "Same difference," Sarah said. "The end result is the same. Everything changes, and you have to figure out who you're going to be on the other side of it." The notification about Karen Richardson came in May, the week before Mark's final exams. He almost didn't read it. It was another local news alert, and he trained himself not to automatically engage with content related to his old neighborhood. But he clicked anyway, out of habit or masochism or some combination of both. The headline read, "Local nonprofit under investigation for financial inspirational." Mark's breath caught. The article detailed an investigation by the state attorney general into Community Springs, the nonprofit where Karen had served on the board. An anonymous report had been submitted detailing the suspicious distribution of funds, the seemingly unjustified compensation for board members, and the pattern of oversight failures that had allowed the arrangements to persist. The investigation had been ongoing for several months and was now moving toward potential charges of fraud and misuse of charitable resources. Karen Richardson was named in the article as a board member who was cooperating with investigators and who had voluntarily resigned from her position. Mark read the article twice. He had no doubt who had submitted the anonymous report, someone with knowledge of the nonprofit's operations and access to its financial records, someone with motivation to expose what Karen had been doing. His first instinct was to feel vindicated. His investigation had been right. The improprieties were real. Someone had acted on the information, even if it wasn't him. But as he read further, he felt something more complicated. The article noted that the investigation was expected to impact at least 3 other board members, in addition to Karen. It would likely result in the nonprofit's closure, at least temporarily, while restructuring occurred. The families that the nonprofit served, the ones struggling families that it was supposed to help, would lose access to the services they depended on. In her rush to destroy Mark, Karen had built an organization that was fundamentally corrupt. And now that corruption was collapsing, and the people who would suffer most were the ones who'd had nothing to do with it. Mark set down his phone and sat very still. He didn't plan to contact Karen, didn't intend to reach out or offer support or do anything that would suggest a reconciliation. But when her name appeared in another article 3 weeks later, a profile in the Sunday magazine section discussing how community leaders fall from grace, Mark found himself driving to her house. The house had been rebuilt after the fire. It looked different from what he remembered, newer, more modern, clearly done with insurance money and expedited construction. It looked like a house but not like a home, like a shelter from consequences. Mark parked down the street and sat in his car, trying to articulate why he'd come here. He wasn't here to gloat. The article made clear that KARENS' reputation was destroyed. Her family was reeling from the investigation. Her husband had apparently started proceedings for divorce. Her kids were dealing with the fallout of having a mother who'd been publicly exposed as corrupt. She was, in short, experiencing some version of what he'd experienced. And Mark felt almost nothing. That was what struck him most, the absence of satisfaction. KAREN had been humiliated, the narrative had been written against her, her perfect reputation had shattered. And Mark, who'd spent so many dark hours imagining exactly this scenario, felt only a kind of tired sadness. Because humiliation didn't actually fix anything. Exposure didn't make you a better person. Consequences didn't automatically generate wisdom. All it did was create more damage, more pain, more victims. When KAREN came out of her house, she didn't see Mark's car at first. She was dressed casually, in the kind of clothes that suggested she'd stopped performing for an audience. No makeup, no carefully curated athleisure, just a woman who'd learned that nobody was watching anymore. She got into her car and drove away, and Mark followed, not to confront her but simply to see where she went. She drove to a small park on the edge of town, the kind of place that wasn't particularly beautiful or impressive, just a quiet green space with benches and walking paths. She got out and walked, moving slowly, not looking around, not checking her phone. She was, Mark realized, grieving, not for herself but for the loss of who she'd thought she was. Mark got out of his car and, after a moment of hesitation, walked toward her. KAREN saw him and froze. Fear flickered across her face. He was surprised to see it was actual fear, not the calculated wariness she'd shown at his last visit. "If you're here to say, 'I told you so,'" KAREN said, her voice hard but shaking slightly, "you can leave." "I'm not here to say anything," Mark said. I wanted to see if you were okay." KAREN's expression shifted to something that might have been contempt or might have been something more complicated. "You destroyed me," she said. "Don't pretend to care about my well-being now." "I didn't," Mark said. "I investigated you, yes, I compiled information, but I didn't submit the report. I didn't go to the authorities. Someone else did that." KAREN's eyes narrowed. "Why should I believe that?" "Because if I'd wanted to destroy you, I could have sent that information to every person in our neighborhood. I could have built a case that would have been far worse than what actually happened. I didn't do that. Not because I forgave you, but because I realized that destroying you wouldn't actually fix anything that happened to me." KAREN sat down on one of the benches, as if her legs had suddenly given out. Mark sat on the opposite end, maintaining distance. "I don't understand what you want," KAREN said. "I don't want anything," Mark said. "I just wanted you to know that I'm done with the cycle, with the revenge, with trying to make things even. I'm moving on, and I wanted you to know that you don't have to spend the rest of your life wondering if I'm going to strike back." "That's not magnanimity," KAREN said bitterly. "That's just cowardice dressed up as virtue." "Maybe," Mark said. He didn't actually care what KAREN thought of his motivations. "But it's the truth." They sat in silence for a while. Mark could see KAREN processing, trying to figure out what the game was, what Mark was actually after. Finally, she said, "My kids hate me. Did you know that? The fire, the investigation, all of it, they know it's because of things I did. My older son told me he doesn't trust anything I've ever told him because he doesn't know which version is real anymore. And my husband is leaving. He said he married the woman I pretended to be, not the woman I actually am." "I'm sorry," Mark said, and he meant it. Not because he felt KAREN deserved sympathy, but because the destruction of a family was sad, even when that family had caused suffering. "You're sorry," KAREN repeated. It sounded like she was testing the words, trying to see if they fit. "That's interesting. After everything I did to you, you're sorry about what happened to me." "Yes," Mark said. "And you should probably be sorry about what you did to me, to my life, to that teenager you warned people away from, to everyone else you've destroyed to protect your reputation." KAREN didn't respond, but Mark could see her shoulders collapse slightly, as if the weight of that recognition had finally become too heavy to carry. Mark stood up. "I'm going back to school," he said. "Trying to do something with the second half of my life that actually matters. I hope you do the same." He walked away before KAREN could respond, back to his car, back to the life he was building. In his rearview mirror, he could see her still sitting on the bench, alone, looking smaller than she had any right to. The final exam was brutal. 4 hours of questions designed to test everything Mark had learned over the past year about ecosystem dynamics, conservation biology, and environmental policy. His hands cramped. His mind went blank twice. There were probably 5 questions he got completely wrong. When he walked out of the testing center, he felt hollowed out but oddly peaceful. It didn't matter if he aced the exam or failed it. The important part was that he'd actually taken it, that he'd actually completed the year, that he'd actually done what he said he was going to do. Sarah was waiting for him outside, and when she saw his face, she pulled him into a hug without saying anything. "That bad?" she asked when they stepped apart. "That hard," Mark said, not sure about the results. "You'll be fine," Sarah said with a kind of confidence that was probably misplaced but felt good nonetheless. "You always are." They grabbed coffee and sat in the campus center, watching the other students celebrate or commiserate their way through the end of semester. Mark felt old among them, but in a good way. He had perspective they didn't have. He'd already lived enough life to understand that this one exam didn't define him. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Do you keep going full degree?" "Yeah," Mark said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'm going to finish the bachelor's degree, then probably a master's if I can get funding. I think I want to do conservation work. Maybe nonprofit, maybe government. Somewhere I can actually help fix things instead of just managing money." "That's beautiful," Sarah said, and she meant it. "What about you?" Mark asked. "Same trajectory," Sarah said. "And then maybe I'll work in environmental justice. There's this organization I want to reach out to that focuses on climate issues in low-income communities. They might have internship programs." They talked for another hour, making plans for summer, discussing what classes they'd take next semester, imagining futures that actually felt achievable now that they'd made it through the hardest part. The letter came in Mark's mailbox on the first Thursday of June. It was a real letter, handwritten, with actual postage. Not an email, not a text. Something that suggested Karen had taken time to think through what she wanted to say. Mark recognized her handwriting from the neighborhood emails he'd received months ago. He opened it carefully. "Mark, I've been thinking about what you said to me in the park, about the cycle ending with you, about not striking back. I didn't understand it at the time, and I'm still not sure I understand it fully now. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not because I'm afraid of consequences, and not because my family has fallen apart, although both of those things are true. I'm sorry because I've had time to think about who I am and what I've done, and I don't like the person I see when I'm honest with myself. I manipulated people. I destroyed reputations when they threatened me. I treated my children like extensions of myself instead of separate people with their own experiences and feelings. I justified it all as protection, as looking after my family, but really it was just control. And when you wouldn't be controlled, I attacked you. You could have destroyed me the way I destroyed you. You had the ammunition. Instead, you chose not to. I don't know if that was forgiveness or just strategy, but it's what forced me to actually look at myself, because if you had attacked me back, I could have justified being a victim. Your refusal to do that took that excuse away from me. I'm in therapy now, actually talking to someone about why I needed everyone to like me so desperately, why I could never admit weakness, why I had to win every interaction. It's not pretty and it's not fast. The nonprofit has filed for restructuring. I've cooperated fully with the investigation. I'm not going to serve on any boards anymore. I'm trying to actually help families in crisis instead of just pretending to while taking their money. My kids still don't trust me and my husband is gone. I don't know if I can fix either of those things, but I'm trying. I hope your life is better now. I hope I didn't do permanent damage. And I hope, if we ever see each other again, we can both be people who don't need to win. Karen." Mark read the letter 3 times, then sat holding it, not sure what to feel. Forgiveness wasn't automatic. Understanding someone's motivation didn't make their actions less painful. And a letter, no matter how sincere, didn't undo months of suffering. But it did mean something. It meant that his refusal to destroy her had actually had an impact. It meant that the cycle could be broken, even if breaking it didn't solve everything. That afternoon, Mark wrote a response. "Karen, thank you for writing. I believe you mean what you wrote. I want to be clear, I haven't forgiven you and I'm not sure I need to. Forgiveness implies a return to the way things were, and I don't want that. What happened to me changed my life, and while I'm genuinely grateful for where I am now, getting here cost me dearly. But I also understand that you were operating from your own damage, your own insecurity, your own need to maintain control. That doesn't excuse your actions, but it does explain them in a way that makes it easier not to hate you. If you're serious about changing, I believe in the work you're doing. And if we ever see each other again in public, I think we can be civil. Maybe eventually even friendly, though I understand if that's not realistic. I hope your therapy helps. I hope your kids eventually understand that people can change, that their mother is trying to become someone different. That's all any of us can do, try to be better than we were. Good luck. Mark. He didn't write "forgive me" or "I forgive you." He left it where it was, acknowledgement without absolution, understanding without absolution. It felt balanced, it felt real. The summer of Mark's redemption, or reconstruction, or whatever word fit the process of rebuilding himself from ash, was quiet and productive. He continued his work at the Environmental Center, expanding his role to include more projects. He started volunteering with a local conservation nonprofit, getting experience in the kind of work he wanted to do after graduation. He took an online class to get ahead on his requirements. And he tried to be a normal human being instead of a man defined by conflict and consequence. He saw Sarah at least once a week. They became something more than friends, but less than a couple, the kind of relationship that existed in the gray area where two people understood each other's damage and met each other there with gentleness. When asked how he was doing by people at the Environmental Center, Mark gave honest answers. "I'm working through some things, trying to build something better." People responded to that honesty. They opened up about their own struggles in return. Life became less about outcomes and more about processes. In August, Mark drove past his old house for the first time since he'd moved out. The renters he'd been able to attract were an older couple, recently retired, who'd taken the place as an interim rental while they decided where they wanted to live long-term. They were tending the yard, had planted some new shrubs, were transforming it into something different from what it had been. Mark felt a surprising lack of attachment to it. The house had been important as a symbol of success, as a marker of achievement. But without that weight, it was just a structure, a place where he'd lived, not the culmination of his entire existence. He drove away and didn't feel the need to look back. The news came in early September, when the fall semester was starting. Mark heard about it from Sarah, who'd seen it on a community social media group. KARENS Richardson and her two youngest sons had moved out of the neighborhood. She'd sold her house to a young family moving to the area. The sale hadn't been publicized. She'd apparently just listed it quietly and moved on. The letter had also mentioned this. "I'm moving to a smaller house in a different community where nobody knows who I was before. My kids and I need to start fresh somewhere that isn't haunted by who I used to be." Mark didn't feel relieved or happy about this news. He felt something more neutral. KARENS had made a decision about her life, just as he'd made a decision about his. They were living their new lives in separate spaces, which was probably for the best. The cycle was finally broken. By the end of his second year in school, Mark's GPA was 3.8. He'd been accepted into a summer internship program with a conservation nonprofit that worked on wetlands restoration. He'd made real friends among his classmates. He'd built something solid, something that felt like it might actually last. He was 46 years old, starting from essentially nothing, and somehow that felt like the most appropriate place to be. The day before his birthday, Sarah surprised him with dinner, not at a restaurant, but at her apartment, something she'd cooked herself. It was good but slightly imperfect, the way homemade food usually is. "I wanted to tell you something," Sarah said after they'd eaten. "I'm leaving after next semester." Mark's heart sank, leaving school. "No, leaving here," Sarah said. "There's a graduate program I got accepted to. It's across the country, and I'm going to take it." "Oh," Mark said, processing. "That's good, that's really good. How are you feeling about it?" "Scared," Sarah admitted. "Excited, but also, I wanted you to know that I'm grateful for you, for understanding what this was, what I needed it to be. Not everyone can do that. Most people want the relationship to be something it wasn't designed to be." Mark nodded. "I'm grateful for you too, and I'm going to miss you, but I'm glad you're going." "You could come with me," Sarah said. "I mean, you don't have to stay here. You're not tied to this place." Mark considered it. It would be impractical, probably foolish. It would mean leaving the programs he'd developed, the work he'd started, the life he was building. But it also represented freedom. The freedom to choose based on what he actually wanted instead of what he thought he should do. Mark Tanner stood in a coastal estuary in North Carolina, teaching a group of high school students about salt marsh ecology. He was 49 now, the director of educational outreach for a nonprofit that focused on coastal conservation. He'd finished his bachelor's degree, earned his master's in environmental science, and built a career that meant something to him in ways his accounting job never had. Sarah was here with him, actually. They'd worked through the long-distance relationship for a year before Mark had taken the leap and moved to where she was pursuing her graduate degree. They now lived together in a small house near the coast, where they could both do the work they'd chosen. The students were learning about succession, about how salt marshes rebuilt themselves after disturbance, about the resilience of ecosystems. "The marsh looks totally destroyed after a hurricane," Mark was explaining, gesturing to an area that had been heavily damaged the previous year and was now recovering. "But the roots are still there, underground, still alive. And once the water clears and the sediment settles, those roots send up new growth. The ecosystem is stronger because it has to be." "But what if the damage is too severe?" one of the students asked. "What if the roots die?" "Then it takes longer," Mark said. "Sometimes a lot longer, but life finds a way. It might not look like it did before, but it adapts. It rebuilds. It becomes something new." He'd become very good at speaking in metaphors about ecological restoration. It was partly pedagogical, but mostly because he'd lived the metaphor. In his personal email, Mark occasionally received messages from Karen. She was living in Oregon, working with an organization that helped at-risk youth. She'd rebuilt some kind of relationship with her two youngest sons, though her oldest had chosen to maintain distance. She was no longer married. She was, by all accounts, actually happy in a way that seemed genuine instead of performative. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything, really. She just occasionally sent updates, checking in on how he was doing, wishing him well. Mark responded to these emails, but he kept his responses brief. He didn't need to be Karen's confidant or her source of validation. But he also didn't hate her, which 5 years ago he would have thought impossible. He was proud of that. It felt like evidence that he'd actually healed. The question that Mark sometimes asked himself, late at night when he couldn't sleep, was whether he'd learned the right lesson from the sprinkler system. The obvious lesson was that booby traps were bad, that violence was wrong, that responding to vandalism with potentially lethal force was an overreaction. But there was a deeper lesson, and it was one that Mark tried to teach his students whenever he could, that the cycle of harm only breaks when someone decides not to perpetuate it, even when perpetuating it would feel justified. It would have been justified for Mark to destroy Karen. It would have been righteous. The information he'd compiled was real, the wrongdoing was real, the consequences she deserved were real. But justice, actual justice, the kind that mattered, had to involve some element of mercy, had to involve the recognition that everyone was damaged and operating from that damage, even the people hurting you. That had taken him years to truly understand. Sometimes, when Mark was alone in his office at the nonprofit, he'd pull up the news articles from 5 years ago. The stories about the suburban homeowner who'd installed an illegal water system. The narrative of his villainy, his danger, his instability. He'd read them and feel a kind of sadness for the man he'd been then. Not shame, he'd worked through that, but compassion for someone who'd been hurt and had chosen the wrong way to respond. That man no longer existed. The person who'd installed the sprinkler system, who'd planned to destroy Karen's reputation, who'd been consumed by anger and the desire for revenge, that person had been replaced. Not by someone better, necessarily, just by someone different, someone who'd learned that the only way to break the cycle was to absorb the hit and refuse to pass it along. On a morning in late September, 5 years after the original incident, Mark received an email from an unknown sender. It was from the 14-year-old he'd hurt with the sprinkler system. He was now 19, a freshman in college, studying mechanical engineering. The email was short. "Mr. Tanner, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I found your email through the nonprofit website. I wanted to tell you something. My therapist recently asked me about the incident 5 years ago, about how it still affected me. And I realized that it didn't really. The broken rib healed. The embarrassment faded. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim of an angry neighbor. But more than that, I remembered something my therapist said, that the reason that incident didn't define my life was because you didn't come after us again. You could have. My mom certainly thought you would, expected you would, but you didn't. I found out later about the scholarship fund, the one you set up. I didn't use it. I didn't know about it until I was already here at college, already independent. But the gesture meant something. It meant that you saw us as people, not enemies. I just wanted you to know that. I think you did something hard, and I respect that. James Richardson. Mark read the email 7 times, then saved it to a folder. He wouldn't respond immediately. He'd sit with it for a few days, let it settle, make sure his response came from a place of genuine connection rather than the need to manage someone else's narrative about him. But he would respond. He would tell James that he was glad he was okay, that he was proud of what the younger man was accomplishing, that forgiveness didn't have to flow in one direction only. And then Mark would go back to his work, teaching students about the resilience of ecosystems, about how destruction wasn't permanent, about how transformation was always possible. He'd learned all of that from the worst moment of his life. And somehow that made it worthwhile. The end. Epilogue, the cycle complete. In the years following, Mark Tanner became known in certain circles as a man who understood second chances. His nonprofit expanded, in part because of his reputation for taking on difficult cases, families who'd been through trauma, kids who'd made mistakes, communities fractured by conflict. He had a gift for seeing past the surface narrative to understand the damage underneath, the wound that had caused the behavior. His work was never easy. It was often frustrating, sometimes heartbreaking, but it mattered in a way that accounting never had. Sarah and Mark never married, but they built a life together that was solid and real. They had good years and hard years, like everyone else. They learned that understanding someone's pain didn't mean accepting their behavior. They learned that love was complicated and didn't always look the way you expected. KARENS Richardson lived a quiet life in Oregon, doing work that helped kids. She never regained the reputation she'd had before, never returned to the position of power she'd occupied in her suburban community. In some ways, that was a loss. In other ways, it was a gift, the freedom to be ordinary, to not have to perform, to not have to win. And James Richardson, that 14-year-old who'd swung a bat at a tree in someone else's yard, graduated with honors, started a career designing irrigation systems for sustainable agriculture, and eventually reached out to Mark when he was designing something that might help with coastal wetlands restoration. They worked together on it, not as enemies or victims, but as two people who'd learned something valuable from their collision with each other. The sprinkler system was decommissioned and forgotten, a footnote in a larger story about what happened when people decided to stop hurting each other. But in the way of all stories, it continued to ripple outward, affecting people who'd never known it existed, teaching lessons that went far beyond the suburban yard where it had all started. Because in the end, the real story wasn't about the system itself or the destruction it caused. The real story was about what happened when someone decided that breaking the cycle mattered more than winning the war. And how sometimes that decision changed everything. Mark stood at the edge of a restored salt marsh, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. He was 54 now. Silver was appearing in his hair. His hands showed the work he'd done, the years spent outside, in water, in mud, in the patient practice of restoration. A young woman stood beside him, one of his students from a program he was running, a girl who'd been struggling with direction and purpose just like he had before everything fell apart. "Is it true what they say," she asked, "about what happened to you, about the sprinkler system?" Mark smiled. The story had become legend around the nonprofit, though few people knew the full version. "Mostly," he said, "the facts are all true, the interpretations are complicated." "I looked you up," the girl said. "After I started working here, I found some of the old articles. You seemed angry, like you were a dangerous person." "I was," Mark said. "I made a choice that was dangerous. Fortunately, I made a different choice after that." "Why?" the girl asked. Why not follow through? Why not destroy the woman like everyone says she deserved? Mark was quiet for a moment, watching the water shift as the light changed. Because, he said finally, I realized that destroying her wouldn't actually fix anything that happened to me. It would just create more destruction, more victims, more people operating from pain instead of healing. So you just forgave her? No, Mark said. I never forgave her, not really, and she never needed my forgiveness. She needed to forgive herself. She needed to become someone different. That was her work, not mine. But what about you? The girl pressed. How did you heal? I didn't heal, Mark said. Healing isn't really a thing. You don't go from broken to fixed. You go from broken to different. You learn to carry the damage in a way that doesn't destroy you. They stood in silence as the sun dropped lower. I'm thinking about quitting, the girl said finally. I don't think I'm cut out for this work. It's too hard, and I don't know if I'm doing any good. Mark turned to look at her directly. Everyone feels that way, he said. Every person who does this work feels it sometimes. The question isn't whether you're qualified or whether it's hard. The question is whether you can keep showing up anyway, even when it doesn't feel like enough. Is that what you do? The girl asked. Yes, Mark said. Every single day, I show up, I do the work, I try not to hurt anyone in the process. And sometimes it's enough and sometimes it's not. But I keep doing it. The girl nodded slowly. I'll stay, she said, at least for another year. Good, Mark said. That's all any of us can do, 1 year at a time, 1 day at a time, 1 decision at a time. They walked back to the car as the light faded completely. Behind them, the salt marsh continued its ancient work of transformation. Broken down and rebuilt, destroyed and restored, changing constantly and staying fundamentally itself. And in that transformation, invisible to the eye but real nonetheless, lay the answer to every question about redemption, about whether people could change, about whether the cycle could actually be broken. It could. It just took someone willing to absorb the hit and refuse to pass it along.